Hello, everyone. I'm Gustavo Tolosa, and I welcome you to this book club in which we are reading Reversing Diabetes by Dr. Neil Barnard. And this has been a very wonderful book. I hope you have enjoyed it. We are in chapter 9. As we wait for everybody to come in, I want to make a few announcements. We have 2 more sessions after today, and then we'll finish this book. And I have, in a couple of weeks, an announcement as to what the next book club will be. And I know that you will enjoy it. It will be a very special book, and the author will also be present at times, and we will also have some cooking demos and other guests. So I hope that you will join. I want to announce that I will be doing the Cooking with Gustavo webinar. It's going to be eggplants and movie music. It's going to be a webinar with 3 recipes that use eggplants, and you will love them. And then Leonardo, my friend violinist, and I will perform for you some wonderful music from movies. And if you want to sign for that, let's see, if you want to sign up for that, I'm putting it here. And let's see, I have done a webinar with Dr. Lyle just a couple of days ago, and with Dr. McDougall, and those are in my YouTube channel. And make sure you watch them. They are just amazing. In the description of this video, you will also find the link to those the links to those webinars, as well as the registration page for the cooking webinar. And I just want to invite you to visit my website, plantemas.com, and my social media. You can find me on Facebook under Dr. Starch, and YouTube under my own name. So let's get started. We are in chapter 9, and let's see here. Feel free to write any comments or questions that you may have, and we can interact that way. So what happens here on page 126 when it says not losing weight? So Dr. Barnard says that the average rate is about 1 pound per week. Some people lose faster than others, but that is the average. Because this is not a short-term starve yourself diet, it does not cause hunger, so there is no rebound binging. Sometimes losing weight can be a bit like following the stock market. There are fluctuations up and down, but the trend should be clear. If you are not losing weight, it is time to take action. And here are the steps to take. One step is to go back to the basics, and the basics are in chapter 4. And that means basically no animal products at all, and that if your diet includes fish or cheese, for example, your weight loss efforts will be hampered. Check for hidden oils. Packaged food should include no more than 3 grams of fat per serving. If you frequently eat at restaurants, try to assess to what extent they are packing oils into their meals. And then do a quick fiber check. If you check your fiber intake, you can see page 112, and find that you are eating less than 40 grams of fiber per day, you will want to bring in more beans, more vegetables, more fruits. Another thing you can do is simplify it. It pays to choose simple foods rather than processed food products. The fewer ingredients, the better. One ingredient is ideal. Beans, broccoli, carrots, or brown rice, for example, do not need an ingredient list because what you see is exactly what you get. And then another thing you can do is add more raw foods. Some people have had remarkable weight loss as a result of increasing their intake of raw foods. Chopped vegetables, salads, fresh fruit, they're all rich in fiber with no added fat and low glycemic index. So here comes now a discussion that is very important on page 129, because since this is a way of eating that is based on starches, which are complex carbohydrates, many people, they imagine that beans, lentils, pasta, sweet potatoes, or yams will push their blood glucose upward. And of course, if you check your blood glucose after just about any meal, it will be higher than it was before. And so this is something that is very simple, but you have to understand that if you check your blood sugar levels right after you eat, after any meal, it's going to be higher than before you ate. However, don't let this turn you against starchy foods and back toward fatty or high protein foods. Here's why. The fat in fish and chicken will tend to arrest your weight loss. It will also tend to aggravate your insulin resistance. Remember a few chapters back how we learned that the real issue with diabetes is the fat, not the sugar. Why? Because fat gets inside the cells, and when the glucose, and the insulin try to get in the cell so that it can give you energy and do what you need to do on a daily basis, it cannot get in, so it remains in your bloodstream. So it is the fat. And when you see the webinar that I did with Dr. McDougall, he says the same thing. So here is what happens in the typical case. A man has heard that carbs are bad, or perhaps notices that his blood glucose has gone up briefly after a meal of rice or starchy vegetables. He decides to avoid carbohydrates and adds fish and chicken back into his diet. At first, it seems like a good change. His blood glucose does not spike strongly after meals because there is very little starch in his meals to provide glucose. Aha, he says, I have found a diet to keep my blood sugar down. Over the next several days, however, he notices that his fasting blood glucose values are heading in the wrong direction. They go up a bit by bit, and after a week or two, the rise is significant. Now what, he thinks, this is what is going on. There are only 3 sources of calories: carbohydrate, fat, and protein. In avoiding carbohydrate, he was left with fat, which tends to increase insulin resistance, and protein, which has problems of its own. The increased fat intake did not increase his blood sugar immediately, but fatty diets tend to increase the amount of fat inside the cells. The result is that insulin resistance gradually gets worse. This means that any carbohydrate he ate later would cause a bigger blood sugar spike than it otherwise would have. As the days went by, his blood sugar gradually increased. The answer to this is to avoid fatty foods and choose healthy, carbohydrate-rich foods, letting the glycemic index help you choose the best of them. and you can see chapter 4 for that. This means legumes, beans, peas, and lentils, vegetables, fruits, and whole grains. Meals will always cause a temporary rise in blood sugar glucose. This is what you want to really understand in this chapter. This is on page 129. Meals will always cause a temporary rise in blood glucose. What you are looking for is an overall trend downward as your insulin sensitivity gradually improves. So give it time, and you're looking at the big picture, not at what happened after one meal. Then he says, see your doctor. One common reason for rising blood glucose levels is infection. A cold, a urinary tract infection, a food sore, an ear infection, you name it. They all tend to raise your blood glucose. Sometimes a surprisingly small cut or cough you're hardly aware of boosts your fasting blood sugar values. What else will make your blood sugar levels higher? Stress. Stress raises blood sugar. So you may want to try meditation, yoga, or other techniques that can help you deal with stress. You can also go to exercise. If you're sedentary, now is the time to bring physical activity into your life, because being sedentary will also help in having higher levels of sugar in your blood. So what happens when you have persistent hunger? If you're cutting back on calories in an effort to lose weight, you may be left hungry, and that's not the point in this wonderful way of eating. One of the reasons I recommend a low-fat vegan diet is that it is so substantial. It provides plenty of fiber to fill you up and has no limits on portion sizes or calories. The result is weight loss without hunger. Maybe you need to eat more, he says. Maybe that little bowl of oatmeal is just not enough. When you're just getting to know new foods, it takes a little time to figure out the right serving sizes. You will soon sort this out. And then go with these two things. Go with high fiber foods and go with low GI if possible. Always within plant-based. Don't go to, let's say, cheese, because cheese will be low GI, but it's extremely detrimental because, as you know, it's mostly fat, and fat is actually the problem and the reason that you're diabetic. So now we go into a topic that is very interesting, and it touches all of us, and that is cravings. So on page 132, Dr. Barnard talks about cravings. Here is the most important thing to understand about cravings. They are not caused by weak will or gluttony. Cravings are triggered by biological properties of the food themselves. So he says, let me be clear. Only certain foods lend themselves to cravings. The same foods are alluring to almost everyone. 4 types of foods trigger biochemical effects not unlike those of addictive drugs. And these are the 4 types of food. And number 1 is sugar. Sugar is not simply sweet. It also has a mild drug-like effect. It affects the brain in essentially the same way as an opiate drugs, morphine and heroin, for example, although maybe not as strongly. This effect helps explain why people crave sugar, especially during times of stress. How do we know that sugar has this effect? In controlled studies, researchers use a medication called Naloxone as a research tool. Naloxone is normally used in emergency rooms to block the effects of heroin or other opiates. And this is very interesting. It gets very interesting. If a person has overdosed on heroin, doctors inject naloxone, which blocks the heroin and other narcotic from attaching to receptors in the brain. A comatose drug addict, previously on the verge of death, rapidly awakens with a dose of naloxone. Researchers have given naloxone to volunteers and offered them various sugary foods. They then measured how much the volunteers ate and compared the results to those of the same test done without naloxone. It turns out that naloxone causes a noticeable drop in sugar cravings. Normally, you might long for a glazed donut or a piece of pie, but with a dose of naloxone, much of that attraction is gone. The effect is particularly clear for foods that contain both sugar and fat, cookies, cakes, and ice cream. Naloxone is given intravenously and is not a treatment for food addiction. This is important to understand because you cannot go and get that drug. It is only a research tool. These experiments show that sugar does not simply delight the taste buds. It also stimulates the release of opiate chemicals in the brain. Just as intense exercise causes the release of endorphins, natural feel-good chemicals within the brain, sugar seems to do something very similar. Let me be clear about this. Sugar does not contain opiates, okay? That's important to understand. Rather, the taste of sugar on the tongue is what apparently triggers the release of opiates within the brain, called dopamine. Very important word, dopamine, which is the key to the brain's pleasure centers. Drugs of abuse, heroin, cocaine, marijuana, tobacco, alcohol, and all others increase dopamine activity in the brain. Sugar appears to do the same. Evidence suggests that the effects of sugar on the brain ease pain and discomfort and gives us a little boost. No wonder we turn to sugary foods, especially when we're stressed. Sugar has the same effects on infants just a few hours old. When babies have a heel stick to draw a blood sample, they cry noticeably less if a bit of sugar water is dribbled into their mouth first. Sugar cravings go beyond plain sugar itself. Some people also crave foods such as white bread or bagels, which turn to sugar rapidly and release sugar into the bloodstream. In essence, they crave high glycemic index foods, sugar, cookies, crackers, white bread, potatoes, or cold cereals. While we also enjoy low GI foods, we tend not to crave them. What is another food that we crave besides sugar? Chocolate. Chocolate's addictive qualities have long been recognized in psychiatric journals. And in scientific studies, The most ardent chocoholics' desire falls away when they are treated with opiate-blocking drugs. Again, these experiments show that it is not simply taste or mouthful that keeps us hooked. Chocolate also appears to have mild effects on our brain. Chocolate's attraction is not due simply to its sweetness. After all, no true chocolate lover would be satisfied with sugar alone. Chocolate also contains caffeine, theobromine, and then phenylethylamine. These are all stimulants, and they may play a role in chocolate's seduction aside from its opiate effects. You don't just feel you want it, you feel you need it. Regrettably, chocolate carries not only a load of sugar, but also a considerable load of fat. What other food out of the four that he wants to mention? Cheese. Yes, it may smell a bit like old socks, but cheese is one of the foods that people who are trying to improve their diets have the most trouble leaving behind. There is something about it, and that something may be the dairy protein called casein. Casein behaves in a particular way. As it breaks apart, it does not simply release individual amino acids. It breaks into short strings of amino acids. They are not just the amino acid building blocks for protein, they are also biologically active compounds with a mild narcotic action. Scientists call them casomorphins, casein-derived morphine-like compounds. If scientists were to feed you cheese and then take a sample of your digestive tract contents, they would find an array of casomorphins with mild narcotic. What else? What is the fourth thing? Meat. Men, in particular, often describe meat as the very last food they would ever want to give up. No matter how often they are reminded of what it is doing to their waistline or cholesterol test results, many have trouble breaking their emotional attachment to roast beef, steak, or chicken wings. Once again, experiments with opiate blocking drugs suggest that part of the desire for meat may have its basics in opiate effects within the brain. So in page 135, he says, resetting your priorities. And the fact is, you are not attracted just to any food or even to most foods. You may like apples, oranges, bananas, or asparagus, but you have never once turned to them for solace during moments of stress. And that is true. You know, we're stressed. We don't go to the refrigerator to look for broccoli or to eat an apple. We go for what will give us that dopamine pleasure, which are these foods, the sugar or the chocolate or the cheese or the meat. You have never raced off to a convenience store because you just had to have cauliflower. You have turned to sugar, chocolate, cheese, or meat because they have chemical effects on the brain. Some beverages, such as wine or coffee, also have drug-like effects and can be addictive. But as far as foods go, those four are the ones that work their unfortunate magic on just about everyone. Let's take a closer look at what happens inside your brain when you eat these foods. If you got absolutely no pleasure from eating, you might forget about foods entirely. So he's saying that a lot of this is for survival purposes. Let's say that we were designed in such a way that when we eat high fat, high sugar, high caloric foods that will help us survive in times of famine, if we just didn't get any pleasure for those foods. Likewise, if sex were a total bore, the species would soon die out. Thus, when you eat or have sex, your reward center gives you a little bit of dopamine as a kind of reward. In the process, that dopamine release causes slight neurological changes, changes that put high priority status on repeating whatever you have just done. So that means you eat something, it gives you dopamine, you get pleasure, and now your brain is wired in a way that it tells you that you need to repeat that action. That was fun, your reward center seems to say. Let's be sure to do that again. The problem is that this system is easily hijacked. Alcohol, recreational drugs, tobacco, and yes, unhealthy foods cause significant dopamine release. So not only do you like them, you also want to have them again and again and again. Your pleasure center rearranges your priorities to favor whatever stimulated it most recently. You find yourself planning your day around sugar or chocolate, just as an alcoholic might regularly think about where the next drink is coming from. If you have ever wondered why these otherwise banal foods have such sway, it's because they hijack your brain's pleasure circuitry and your internal priority setting system. So, how do you break free of these cravings? Well, here are some steps, 3 things that Dr. Barnard recommends. Eat a healthy breakfast and don't skip meals. Cravings kick in when you are hungry. Another thing, get regular exercise so you're tired enough to sleep soundly, and be sure to get plenty of rest. Cravings are stronger when you are not sleeping well. And number 3, avoid situations that trigger cravings. Some people find that their cravings are triggered by being alone, by television, cooking shows, by concession stands at movie theaters, or by certain friends who are preoccupied with food problems of their own. Try to identify your triggers and eliminate them as much as possible. So, how can you substitute so that you can have the taste that you want, but without the regrets? Here are some substitutions. If you crave sugar, maybe in recipes you can use maple syrup or molasses or sorghum syrup, or maybe granulated sugarcane juice, sucanat, can sometimes substitute for table sugar. These are hardly health foods, so don't think that these are foods that you need to incorporate every day in your life. But the idea is to replace refined white sugar with a smaller amount of syrup or juice. Stevia is an intensely sweet derivative of an herb from Paraguay. That's something you can use. Sucralose, or Splenda, is a calorie-free sweetener made from cane sugar, to which chlorine has been chemically added, greatly increasing the sweetness of the final product. The disadvantage of this is that these sweeteners don't help you break your love affair with sweets. So when artificial sweeteners are not available, you will find yourself returning to sugar. Of course, the best choices are fresh fruits. Those are nature's sweet foods. It also helps to make sure your diet has adequate complex carbohydrate, grains, sweet potatoes, and beans, for example. These foods provide the energy you need in a form that is much more helpful than sugar. What about if you crave chocolate? Well, cocoa powder is essentially defatted chocolate. It can be used in beverages and baking or turned into a dip for strawberries or other fruit. If you crave cheese, then you probably need to get to know nutritional yeast, which is sold in health food stores or supermarkets. And it adds this cheese-like flavor to sauces and casseroles. In recipes, you can replace ricotta or cottage cheese with mashed, water-packed tofu mixed with a little lemon juice. If you're choosing soy cheeses, read the labels to check the fat content and to see whether they're made with added casein, the dairy protein. And if you crave meat, good substitutes for hot dogs, burgers, and deli meats are now widely available. Seitan, tofu, tempeh, and textured vegetable protein are versatile products that substitute well for meat in recipes. Surprisingly enough, the desire for meat fades very rapidly once it is removed from your diet. So what about genetics? Because a lot of people say, well, I have cravings because my mother had cravings, my parent, my grandparents, my aunt, my uncle, whatever, and so do genetics play a role? So on page 138, it says that some people may be especially vulnerable. Researchers have found that some people are born with fewer receptors for dopamine, the brain chemical responsible for pleasurable feelings. Apparently, this lack of receptors mean that they get less dopamine stimulation and less of the feel-good sensation that dopamine provides. As a result, they are drawn to tobacco, alcohol, drugs. Presumably, they are seeking the stimulation that nature has not given them. They may even fall prey to compulsive gambling or compulsive eating. It all starts with a gene. The receptors for dopamine are built according to the specifications on your chromosomes, the long spiral staircase-shaped strings of genes in each of your cells that determine who you are. Your mother and your father passed along their genes to you, and the makeup of your body reflects the combination of the two. If either parent passed along a gene for having too few dopamine receptors, you would have roughly 1/3 fewer receptors than other people. If you were able to sample individuals in smoking cessation programs or drug treatment clinics, you would find that as many as 40% have a gene that causes them to have too few receptors, called dopamine receptor D2 or DRD2 for short. Ernest Noble, MD at the University of California, Los Angeles, conducted genetic analysis on our patients, Dr. Barnard's patients. To our surprise, we found that nearly half of our research participants with type 2 diabetes had the gene that was associated with fewer than normal dopamine receptors. That is far, far higher than the roughly 1 in 5 prevalence in the general population. This raised a disturbing question. Did the lack of dopamine receptors lead them to overeat? Did overeating then lead them to weight gain, which in turn triggered diabetes? We have not yet sorted all this out, but we did find that while people with this gene improved a great deal on our diet, they got somewhat less benefit compared to those with a normal number of dopamine receptors. At present, this type of genetic testing is done only in research studies. Your doctor cannot determine whether you are genetically endowed with fewer dopamine receptors. Regardless of your genetic makeup, the diet described in this book is very likely to help you. I raised the issue of genetics simply to underscore the point that cravings and food addictions are physical, not moral issues. They are due to the properties of foods themselves that interact with our natural biochemistry. One final point. If certain foods act like drugs, it pays to treat them like drugs. In other words, avoid them. Then Dr. Barnard talks about digestive problems. Some people experience or some foods can cause a bit of gasiness. However, if you experience this, here's what you can do about it. First, only certain foods cause gas. Grains, fruits, and most vegetables get a not guilty verdict. Beans and undercooked cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and cabbage and cauliflowers, Brussels sprouts are the main culprits. Chances are all you need to do is have smaller servings. If you have been replacing a huge steak with a huge plate of beans, remember that a small amount of beans goes a long way. Try downsizing your portion. Over time, you will find that your body adjusts so you can have larger portions. If you cook beans from scratch, be sure to discard the water used to soak them and then cook them in fresh water. Cook them well. There are no al dente beans. The same goes for cruciferous vegetables. Yes, we all love a stalk of fresh broccoli from the crudité tray, but if that gives you digestive trouble, cook vegetables until you can easily pierce them with a fork. Avoid dairy products and sugar, of course. All right. How about high triglycerides? And we are at the end of this chapter. Triglycerides are molecules of fat that are transported in the blood for various purposes. As with cholesterol, having a certain amount of triglycerides in the blood is a normal part of human biochemistry. However, when triglycerides are high, they increase the risk of heart problems, diseases of the pancreas, and other problems. Some studies have suggested that diets high in refined carbohydrates may cause a temporary rise in triglycerides. High fiber and low GI foods appear to have the opposite effect. You will want to make a special point of favoring these foods. Regular exercise helps too. Alcohol appears to raise triglycerides slightly, so when you avoid it, triglycerides slide back down. So to end this chapter, Dr. Barnard talks about the interaction between vegetables and prescription blood thinners. So if you're taking blood thinners, make sure that you talk to your doctor. What matters is maintaining a fairly steady amount of vegetables in your diet. So your warfarin, which is the drug for blood thinning, does not need to be continually adjusted. So this is important. And by the way, he says, alcohol increases the effects of this blood thinner drug. Many medications like aspirin, acetaminophen, and many others can also accentuate warfarin's action. So we have covered a lot of topics in this chapter, and I hope this has helped you. And in the next chapter, chapter 10, we will talk about the supplements to take, and mostly it's B12. And if you're not getting enough sun, perhaps vitamin D, but we will cover that in the next chapter. And what I want to highlight is this idea, this phrase that people say often, that people who have diabetes, that when I take my blood sugar after I eat a starchy based meal, my sugar levels go up. Remember what Dr. Barnard says: sugar levels go up after eating any meal. And yes, it will go up when you eat complex carbohydrates, but what you're looking for is the general trend of going down. Switching to a high-fat diet will only make it worse, because your cells will get more fat in them and you will be more resistant to insulin. So in the long run, your insulin will need to be increased. If you're getting insulin shots, or your medication will need to be increased, that causes in turn gain weight, and it's just a roller coaster of never ending gain weight. You've got to trust that the problem for a diabetic is not the complex carbohydrates, is the fat. So get the fat out of your diet. It may take a while. Don't take your sugar blood levels right after you eat, and look at the long term. Give it a week, and you will see how it improves. Always keep in touch with your doctor, because if you are following this diet strictly, like Dr. Barnard recommends, strictly, numbers will go down and your medication will have to be lowered. So you need to be in touch with your doctor. All right, I hope that this has helped, and I hope that I will see you next week. We have 2 more sessions to finish the book, and then we have a week off, and we start a new book that I know that you will love. Also, remember that you can always contact me by email, and my email is info@plantemus.com, plant, PLANTEMUS.com, and have a wonderful weekend. We're almost there. Bye-bye.